The struggle for North Africa, 1940–43. After a grim struggle that rolled back and forth across the North African desert for nearly 3 years, this campaign resulted in the first major Allied victory of the Second World War, 1939–45. Mussolini attacks. Control of the Eastern Mediterranean was seen as vital to Britain's interests during the Second World War, 1939–45. A large garrison of British and Commonwealth troops was based in Egypt. Its main role was to defend the Suez Canal and protect Britain's oil supplies from the Persian Gulf. On the 11th of June 1940, Italy's fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, declared war on Britain and France. Seeking to expand their imperial possessions in Africa, the Italians invaded Egypt on 13 September from their colony of Libya. Wavell's victory. After a limited advance, the Italians halted and set up a series of fortified camps around Sidi Barrani. In December 1940, General Sir Archibald Wavell's Western Desert Force of 36,000 men attacked the Italians. A mobile armored force under Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor outflanked the Italians at Betaform and pursued them 840 kilometers, 500 miles back to Libya. Wavell's offensive ended at El Alamein on 7th February 1941, with the destruction of 9 Italian divisions and the capture of 130,000 men. Afrika Korps. Hitler realized that he would have to support the Italians in North Africa. On the 11th of February 1941, Major General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps landed at Tripoli. The British won some spectacular victories over the Italians, but found the Germans a much tougher nut to crack. Desert logistics. Logistics were a key factor in the Desert War. Throughout the campaign, both sides found that the further they advanced, the harder it was to keep their forces supplied. Both suffered shortages of fuel at crucial moments. Rapid advances were often followed by equally rapid retreats. Rough terrain and constant sand abrasion on engines made vehicles break down. In the desert, natural water supplies were almost non-existent. Water had to be transported in vehicles like this Bowser. Half of each man's daily ration of 4.5 liters went towards cooking and topping up vehicle radiators. The rest was for drinking, washing, and shaving. Visibility in the desert was hampered by heat haze, dust, and sandstorms. Although troops were kept fit by their officers, adequate drinking water and medical supplies were not always available. Troops had to survive extremely high daytime temperatures and very cold nights. Newly arrived men generally spent time acclimatizing in the Nile Delta before moving into the desert. Disease also took a toll on the troops, who were constantly irritated by millions of flies attracted by food, human waste, and dead bodies. To remedy these problems, the men tried to keep their sections of the desert clean. Not only did the Germans have a daring and imaginative commander in Rommel, but also for several months their tactics proved superior. The main problem for the British was the lack of cooperation between their armor and infantry, meaning they were fighting almost separate battles. The result was that the infantry did not receive the support it might have done, and the armor frequently fell victim to coordinated enemy attacks. Tobruk besieged. On 24 March 1941, Rommel attacked, cutting off the British 3rd Armored Brigade. Wavell's force had already been weakened by the transfer of troops to Greece and East Africa. By the 13th of April, the British had been forced back to the Egyptian frontier, leaving the 9th Australian Division besieged in Tobruk. They held out, but after 2 attempts to relieve Tobruk failed, Wavell was replaced as Commander-in-Chief Middle East by General Sir Claude Auchinleck. On the 18th of November 1941, Auchinleck launched Operation Crusader. This came as a surprise to Rommel, who was launching an offensive of his own against Tobruk. After several days of confused tank battles around Sidi Rezegh, Rommel advanced towards the Egyptian frontier, hoping to cut off the British. The Germans had outrun their fuel supplies and their attack ground to a halt, enabling the British to drive them back. Tobruk was relieved on 7th December, and Rommel was forced to fall back on El Alamein. The Western Desert Force was now redesignated the 8th Army. It was placed under the command of Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, replacing Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham. In January 1942, Rommel attacked again. The British were overextended and had not replaced their earlier losses. Rommel was able to advance beyond Benghazi. From early February to late May 1942, Rommel was halted by the heavily mined British defensive line, which ran from Gazala in the north to Bir Hakeim in the south. At the end of May 1942, the Germans launched a fresh offensive, and after 2 weeks of heavy fighting, broke through. They captured Tobruk and pushed the British back into Egypt. Despite halting Rommel's advance at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, Auchinleck was replaced by Lieutenant General Sir Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief Middle East. At the same time, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery took over command of the 8th Army. Montgomery exuded confidence and rapidly restored the Army's flagging morale. Through Alexander, he also ensured that his men were properly supplied. In late August 1942, Rommel made a last effort to break through. However, short of fuel and supplies, he was repulsed at Alam Halfa. For nearly 2 months, Montgomery continued to train and re-equip his army. By October 1942, Montgomery enjoyed a significant advantage in men, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. He was ready to mount an offensive of his own. On the night of 24 October 1942, under cover of a 600-gun barrage, the 8th Army attacked the Axis positions. After 10 days of bitter attritional fighting, the heavily defended German line was breached. On the 4th of November, Montgomery's armor broke through and the pursuit of the defeated Germans and Italians began. Tobruk and Benghazi were soon retaken. By 23 November, the British were back at El Agheila, and by March 1943, the 8th Army had taken Tripoli and crossed into Tunisia. Meanwhile, on the 8th of November 1942, the Allies had landed in French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria. The invasion force, codenamed Operation Torch, was commanded by the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower and included the British First Army. After their initial resistance, the Vichy French agreed to a ceasefire. The Allies advanced into Tunisia, but the Germans reacted quickly and succeeded in blocking the route to Tunis at Kasserine. Eisenhower was forced to consolidate his forces and develop his lines of communication so they could support a major attack in tandem with the 8th Army. This was accomplished despite ongoing German resistance. By the 20th of March 1943, the advancing 8th Army had linked up with Eisenhower. The pressure on the Axis perimeter around Tunis increased, and on 7th May, the Allies entered the city. 5 days later, 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. The battle for North Africa was over.